Awesome. All right. So Meaghan, welcome. Are you ready to get started?
Yeah, sure am, Bridget. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. I'm just going to do a quick intro of Meaghan for those of you who don't know her. She is a OHS officer at the Australian Education Union. I'm really excited to have her here with us to share the AEU's experience of pushing for proper ventilation in schools, including pushing for air purifiers. But first, I think we should start with the basics. So when we talk about ventilation, just so we're all on the same page, I mean, what do we mean by ventilation at work?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Bridget. And I think it's one of these things that we've become increasingly familiar with over the last 2 to 3 years as part of our lexicon in our language, just as we all talk about flattening curves and, what's other sort of COVID-related things that we all now become sort of little pseudoscience armchair scientists about, is that, ventilation is very clearly something that we know is key as a key COVID control, and it's a key COVID control in our lives, in when we're out dining, when we're out mingling with friends, and it's absolutely a key COVID control in our workplaces as COVID is aerosol spread. So ventilation is really just the movement of air and the capacity of us to be able to dilute the air that we breathe out into our workplaces so as to minimise our risk of infection. And as you said earlier, Bridget, just to highlight that we're not technical experts, we're not ventilation experts, nor are we epidemiologists or anything of that like. So really, I'm going to keep it as simple as that.
Yeah, awesome. So I think you already touched on it, but I mean, why is proper ventilation important for COVID safety?
Yeah, it's become a really key, vital, it's a vital control of a COVID safe return to any workplace. And certainly in my work, and I work as an OHS organiser working with health and safety reps across schools, public schools, primary, secondary and special education, which I think maybe we'll have a chance just to speak discreetly about because it has its own specific issues across our TAFEs. And I can just shout out to my TAFE members that I see in the room today. Shane Wright, I see you. Hello. And of course, our early childhood settings. And all of the health and safety reps and the members across those settings have had really different lived experiences over the journey of COVID. And as such, as the community's learning changed around what was, really key and vital in terms of COVID safe controls, so do all of the health and safety reps and ours, of course, change about how we actually apply those. And ventilation, I think, became a really key conversation that was being had probably about the commencement of 2021, when, our understanding broadly in the community, the public health understanding, started to develop a little bit more about the spread of COVID. And certainly when we're looking at being back in the workplaces about how that may look. And, when we look at the spread of members and the workplaces that I would work directly with, our early childhood workers, and hats off to them if there's any of them in the room today, they remained physically on site through almost the entire pandemic. And they had a brief period of lockdown only during that very large lockdown 6, I think it was. But for the remainder, I know people know what I'm talking about. So when I say lockdown 6, the big one.
Yeah, definitely.
So not the number 2, the big one, number 6. So briefly during that period, our early childhood members worked remotely somewhat, but for the significant bulk of that time, they were on site, exposed throughout that time. Certainly our schools members, and I know that there's a few of them on the line tonight, will have had extraordinary experiences of on and off remote learning and then pivoting. I know that we use that word a lot, but they pivoted incredibly quickly back to being in and out, and then learning about ventilation became a key control. And then our TAFE members, and I know there's some here today, some of whom have been off-site for a significant period of time and are still there, and some of whom were back because their subjects are practical, and so they're really things that can't be taught remotely, or there was an opinion they couldn't be taught remotely at that circumstance. And indeed, all of these issues have to be played in. I think I might have diverged, Bridget. I think I've forgotten your original question, but I think we're talking about how ventilation became incredibly important and how we understood the key elements around it.
Yeah, you definitely answered it though. I mean, we used to think that you caught COVID by, coming into contact with an infective surface. And then there was the talk about droplets. And now we talk a lot about aerosol transmission. So the movement of air in, preventing COVID from just staying stagnant in a room is a lot more important, especially as we return to offices. This is my first week back in the office. It's, you know, more and more important that we've got properly ventilated offices so the air is moving in and out and we're not having just COVID.
Yeah, but our workplaces are not, I mean, we know this now, but it's all very new knowledge. I think, you know, all of us over the course of the last, you know, 2 years have developed extraordinary knowledge very quickly in areas that we perhaps have never had knowledge before. And so we do know all this now, but our buildings and our, you know, our lifestyles, our systems of work, they're not really built necessarily for this reality. And so this is, I guess, where the health and safety reps come in and have to, I think, go back to their basics of health and safety, which is applying the hierarchy of controls and consulting in the workplace to be able to look at the solutions that may be applicable, and then looking at what's actually available to us. For example, air purifiers, which is something that I didn't even know existed sort of 6 months ago, 8 months ago, but now I know way too much about.
Absolutely.
More than I want to.
I mean, if we kind of start at like this, the first thing you would do as a health and safety rep, if you were trying to take action on ventilation. So I guess that would be assessing the risk or identifying the risk.
Yeah.
What would you look for in your workplace to try and see if it's properly ventilated or what could be improved, that kind of thing?
Well, I'll use schools as an example, because I think that this has been a lived experience for many of our members. I think the first thing to have a look at is the same way that you'd approach as health and safety reps any safety issue, is to do a risk assessment, to do an audit, to have a look at what's actually available. In our schools, I work in public schools, and I'm sure I see my comrade here from the AEU. G'day, Tracy. Hello. And I know that you probably face very similar issues in a lot of the buildings in the schools that you work with, is that many of our buildings have not been maintained beautifully, and many of them just don't have windows that open. So, you know, they might be 15, 20, 30, 40 years old. They don't have a maintenance budget. The windows have been a bit dodgy from a couple of years ago. Rather than have the money to fix them, they've nailed them shut. And then over the years, they've been painted shut and they simply don't open anymore. So when a bureaucracy like the Department of Education, with respect to them, which has a huge amount of schools to actually have a look at an audit, they might say, well, typically this building ought to have ventilation at this level because the windows can open. But, you know, perhaps the reality on the ground is a little bit different than that. And so it is really important. I think this is where the power of the union branches and the health and safety reps are on the ground, to be able to voice that and say, actually, you know, when we have a look at, you know, how many air purifiers our school ought to have, or, you know, what's realistic in this environment for the number of people, maybe they considered the fact that these windows previously opened and now they don't open. And it's also that when you work in schools, TAFEs, early childhood, you're not working with pieces of equipment, you don't work with gadgets and gadgets, you work with human beings. And you must consider the system of work around human beings, and our most important human beings, you know, our children. And as such, you know, things like having windows that don't open is often a safety concern for children that may not respond well to open windows. For example, they may abscond, or it might become a subsequent safety issue to have those windows that open, you know, perhaps even on a second floor, or in an environment where children have special needs. So there's a whole raft of things that need to be considered when you're actually having a look at ventilation. And if I can just, you haven't asked me this yet, Bridget, but I'm going to bang on a little bit longer, is that often, of course, ventilation, you know, when we look at it in an ideal world, we also have a capacity to keep thermal comfort within ventilation. But, you know, really we have in February, although thank goodness we didn't have any this year. We didn't have our 40+ days this year, but we normally do. But we certainly had a few in the 30s, and even in the late 20s and the upper 20s, when you're in a back portable of a school teaching computers and you've got some equipment on, no open windows is going to give you the thermal comfort that you require. So you've got to have the air conditioning on, and the air conditioning is inevitably something that recycles air, which many schools are fitted with split system air conditioning. So really being able to, as a health and safety rep, have a look at all of those elements, look at the systems of work and the practical usage of the buildings, and be able to, at a local level, figure out how can we make this work appropriately. And it might require some really creative solutions. And I know our members are remarkable human beings, and they come up with all manner of really remarkable creative solutions. I'm so proud of them. And, you know, they're doing things like, you know, they're teaching online last year, and this year they're teaching outside. It's actually quite extraordinary, the capacity that they have to be flexible and work with the safety that's required.
Awesome. Well, so do you want to kind of start talking about how ventilation might fit in with the OHS Act? So your employer has certain obligations to you to keep you safe at work, safe and healthy at work. So if you were to suggest to the HSRs on the line, I guess, where to start, how to use the OHS Act, what would your suggestions be?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Bridget, because I think sometimes, particularly as we've gone through COVID, we have made the mistake sometimes of believing that we have to be experts and that compliance equals safety. And, you know, it's really important to understand that things can be compliant and also unsafe at the same time. And as such, when we're looking at things like ventilation, there are no hard lines that I can say, you know, measure it up to this point, and beyond that point you must this, or below this point you must that. It really has to have a look at what the rooms are being used for, who the people are in them, what other equipment's in the room, what the flow of work is, what the system of work is, and how you can make that work. So the first thing is for our health and safety reps is you don't have to be an expert. The second thing is always refer to basics. I think whenever I get tied up in ideas and language and thoughts and things that are, you know, really probably not really where I ought to be, I always go back to what the basics of the Act says. And I like to refer to the principles of the Act, you know, which says that workers are entitled to the highest possible level of protection. And it's about securing the health, safety and welfare of employees and persons at work, and we ought to eliminate at the source where possible. And then I reflect on the hierarchy of controls and try to think creatively about exactly how I might approach problems like this from the highest possible level of control, rather than just the one that causes the least impact at the local level and the cheapest one. Actually, one that you can maybe explore a little bit further. And I think this is where forums like this are really helpful, Bridget, because health and safety reps get an opportunity to confer with one another about what's going on in their workplace, and they can share these creative ideas. But I think all the answers that we require are in the Act, and we ought to reflect on it in the same way that we would reflect on any physical hazard that we would be used to working with. You know, a chemical that's inappropriate, a broken chair, a tear in the carpet that someone's going to trip on. You know, we go back to our basics to say that, the employer has an obligation under the Act to provide a workplace that's safe and without risks to health, as far as is reasonably practicable. And there's a definition of what reasonably practicable is. It's not just to get out of everything clause, but health and safety reps play a really key role to lead those discussions and have those discussions locally on behalf of the members that they represent, to say, actually, let's try something else, let's figure out something else, and to play a really strong part in that consultation piece. I think what we've found, Bridget, is that we get our best results for safety for members when we act strongly and we have those good consultation procedures in place. We have had many health and safety reps that have, throughout this 2 years' time, utilised their powers under the Act via PIN, and it hasn't always landed exactly where they want to. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. And I think we should sort of recognise that it's not a silver bullet doing that actually, if problems can be resolved locally, then oftentimes it's a better outcome in the short term and in the long term. So, is health and safety reps, I think, have a really important role to play throughout this time. I mean, I know we're talking about ventilation tonight, but it's a whole range of things, isn't it? Because, as we progress along and we learn a little bit more about, safety, particularly in a COVID world, we're learning all these different things. There's going to be something else that we'll have to sort of apply our hierarchy of controls to and consider in that framework of issue resolution as we do, which is why, it's so good that we've got great health and safety reps out there. And there's a multitude of information out there, but I think if you hold true to those basics, is this safe? Is it something that the members or the people that I represent are comfortable with? Is there a better way that we can do this? Why don't we try something better? If we follow those basics, then we'll always go well, I think.
I think you might have already touched on this, but to kind of jump off that point you made about, like not kind of looking for compliance, but looking for like what's the safest, what's the best way. If, as a hypothetical, say I'm a HSR and I'm in my workplace and my employers said that the ventilation in my workplace is adequate, but I'm not convinced. I don't think it is. I mean, what would you suggest I do as a HSR?
Yeah, I would always suggest, I mean, what you'd indicate by that example is that you've already had a conversation with the employer and that you've commenced a consultative piece under Section 35, or at least in an informal or a formal way commence that consultation. I'd always ask people to go back and revisit and perhaps propose better measures. But if it is something that simply there's a disputation between what an opinion is about whether it is or whether it isn't, or whether it can or whether it can't, oftentimes health and safety reps can't actually progress further through that consultation piece and do require, using their powers. I guess as an organiser of health and safety reps, I do support health and safety reps using PIN and cease work and the like where necessary, and I support them through issue resolution and consultation. I do that not just for health and safety reps, but for managers as well that might be in that work, because I think it's important to get the best outcomes for everybody in there. But sometimes it may be that that there needs to be, someone, the authority, come in and actually, have an examination and say what can be done. And I think I know I've got Maureen here. G'day, Maureen. I can see Ping walking around in the background too. Yep, say hello. And I think Maureen's is probably a really good example where doesn't require a PIN necessarily to seek an opinion externally to get somebody in to provide that support to the parties at the workplace without actually maybe getting to a point where there may be conflict that carries on in a workplace where you have to work intimately with people over time. So there are a multitude of ways that people can approach this, and I guess every situation requires its own advice, but I think the basics of the Act always provide the answers somewhere.
Yeah, so what I'm hearing is revisit the consultation procedure, probably reach out to your union as well for some assistance, and then if you need to start going down the issue resolution pathway, which which involves issuing a PIN if you need to, maybe a cease work. And I think also the compliance is important. I understand that, but I'm always a big believer that we don't need to, as health and safety reps, have conversations necessarily about what compliance is. I think we need to have conversations about what safety is. And sometimes they're the same thing and sometimes they're not. And it's okay when they're not. Yeah, absolutely. Awesome. So did you want to talk about, ventilation in schools? I know this was a massive focus of the AEU for a while. So can you tell me a bit about the education experience for pushing for proper ventilation controls in schools?
It continues, Bridget. So it's a continuing piece of work. Throughout the time of COVID, the main employers, so I represent HSRs across a number of sectors, but for this recollection, I'll refer specifically to schools because it's a one single larger employer, and they have I think a good culture of being able to be consultative and try to keep those doors open, which is terrific. And there was an opportunity for myself and my Deputy Secretary to meet weekly with the Department of Education and with WorkSafe to be able to understand and unpack some of the intent and the changes, that were coming in. And remember, they were coming in very, very, very fast, incredibly fast. And throughout that time also, I have a group of, I have several groups that we work with as health and safety reps. So I have my TAFE health and safety reps, and we're actually meeting this Thursday. Any TAFE health and safety reps in the room want to come along to that? I call it TAFE Safety Matters meeting, and we talk all about, you get to see other TAFE health and safety reps. We have an early childhood group. We check in with our special schools, also check in with our schools, and I have what I call a reference group, which is sort of my health and safety reps that have been around for a long time, been operating at a high level for a long time, and that I would check in with about the work that I'm doing and the information that I have and how to be able to shape that. And many of those health and safety reps participated in consultation directly with policy and development, would read through documents to see how they read to the normal person's ear, as we were going through significant changes as much as possible. So ventilation came as part of that, but obviously we're not experts, we're not epidemiologists, we're not whatever a ventilation expert is called. We're none of those people. We're health and safety organisers. So, we're able to actually speak and reflect on the industry and on what goes on, but the commentary around exactly how many and where and to what level is not something that we had a capacity to actually feed directly into. However, certainly our members around that time at the end of lockdown 6, when there was conversations about return to work, it was a very difficult time, as I'm sure everyone remembers. And it was at that point that many of the conversations turned to HEPA filters, HEPA filtered air purifiers and ventilation and exactly how that would work. And of course, we're all significantly less knowledgeable at that time than we are at this time. We'll be less knowledgeable now than we are in 6 months' time about all this stuff. But certainly I think there was a consensus that these were becoming necessary items to be able to provide safety in our schools. And it was something that we pushed for very strongly, as much as we possibly could. Fortuitously, just before the reintroduction, there was an announcement that the air purifiers would be purchased, 51,000 air purifiers to go to public schools across Victoria and low-fee independent and Catholic schools. And there were 51,000, I believe 12 or 13,000 went to the Catholic and independent sector, and 39,000 went to the public sector. I think it was a terrific commitment. And then, of course, the mechanics about how you actually get that delivered into a system of that size in the time when we have delivery constraints and the like was a lot of the work that overtook everyone in term 4. Tracy, I'm sure Tracy Spill, you would have seen that come out in your schools. Just the sheer logistics of doing that at a point when we're, as a country, working on, having delivery challenges, from other countries and the like. So all of that went out that time. And now, of course, people will be familiar that there's a further 60,000 air purifiers to be bought so that every classroom has an air purifier across those, across the public sector, and then every classroom in those same low-fee paying and Catholic schools. And that was actually based, there were 2 audits that were conducted. The first audit was conducted largely on 100 indicative schools. So, indicative schools were having a look at, the types of models of buildings that they would actually have. Typically schools only have certain structures of buildings and the typical airflow that would be available. Of course, no assessment can be done because they weren't full of children at that point. They didn't actually have people in them, so they couldn't actually look at how much that was.
You can go in with like the CO2 monitor.
They can't do that with no one's breathing in there, But they did do that. They did do that with the CO2 monitors in those same 100 schools. No worries, Tracy. Good to see you, mate. They did do that in the same 100 schools over the course of term 4. There was a report that came out, and I believe, although I've not seen that report as yet, that obviously the recommendations of that report may have gone some way into recommending the additional air purifiers and the accessibility in order to sustain those schools throughout winter. And so that's what I assume has occurred throughout time. But it certainly has been a real push from our members. And certainly there are other things entirely, of course, Bridget, not just the ventilation. That was the entire COVID safe plans. And just to make note, in our early childhood settings, and again, I point out that our early childhood members have largely been on deck for the significant portion of the pandemic and only a very short period of, and are working with under 5s who are, the cohort in our population that remain unvaccinated at this point. And those people have not, I believe, anyone in the room might correct me, have not had government support specifically to sort of bring in air purifiers into those workplaces. They often have indoor-outdoor, very open buildings, and that they have very creative play-based learning, and they can do things creatively in that environment. But still, I think, it's worth noting that they haven't had that significant support. And in our TAFEs as well, while they are often sometimes more modern buildings, sometimes buildings with better ventilation, they have not had that level of support either. And the TAFEs will individually, some of them be really terrific. And I have seen some really good examples of TAFEs being very proactive and very creative, and some not so much.
Awesome. So I'm really excited to hear from Maureen. So Maureen, are you on the line?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you, Maureen.
Yeah.
Oh, great. Yeah. I must be a bit dyslexic in terms of mute and unmute. I just don't quite get it. But delighted to be invited, and I guess my report is, reasonably positive. I sort of came in and I'll talk specifically about the ventilation, but I came into the role halfway through last year, and then of course, you know, then it all happened. Prior to that, I was an assistant OHS, so 6 months assistant, and then I got the job. But we had I just didn't feel confident about measuring air quality. I just didn't feel I had the know-how, and I was concerned, particularly about one particular building, which was new, and it was sealed. Everywhere it was sealed, double sealed, you know, and you couldn't open the windows, and I was mindful of that. So I spoke to Meaghan, had a bit of a discussion, and then I thought the best thing to do is get in touch with Work Safe Victoria. I hope that's the right title, and I actually invited them to come out and do an assessment. And, you know, it was a very practical and logistically manageable process from my perspective. They knew the ropes. They contacted the principal directly and said, we're going to come out and do an assessment. And so I'm sorry, I don't remember her name, but a representative came out, and she was terrific. And we met with, there was myself, the principal, an assistant principal. Yeah, and that was it, the three of us. The three of us walked around the school, and she pointed out what needed to be done, you know, in terms of maximising airflow, right? That was the thing. That was the big thing, maximising airflow, so we went to the purifier just about everywhere, because you couldn't open windows, you couldn't open doors, so that was done and dusted. The next thing, we looked in the old build, and it was more things about seeing if the windows were sealed shut because of 5 years worth of painting, that sort of thing. So we noted that, and that was a recommendation, that make sure you can open the windows and leave the doors open, and also make sure all the fans were working, right? So we did a tour of the school. Probably would have taken more than an hour.
I'm sorry, I think
and then we received a report with very strict.
Sorry, you keep cutting out a little bit, Maureen. I wasn't sure if I lost you.
Can you hear me?
Oh, I can hear you. You're frozen though.
I'm sorry. Yeah.
Oh, good. I reckon maybe press on. Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
You're a bit of a robot, Maureen. Sorry,
and then we. Yeah, and then we received a written report with recommendations. So, and the principal acted on it, and in tandem with that, air purifiers arrived. So I did an assessment, of the whole school in terms of looking at room to room and the level of concern for each room, with a green, orange, and red in terms of that the need for certain areas to get immediate attention, and obviously going in the sky. So it worked quite well. We've got our air purifiers there. The fans are working. People are mindful of leaving open doors. Yeah, and also the last thing we've done, and the principal took this upon himself, he's worked out a routine or a schedule of changing the air filters. So that's something that needs to be done. Once you get the ventilators or whatever, air purifiers, you need to have a schedule of changing the I guess there's a gauze or something there to change. I'm not sure, but that's been put in place. So I'm pretty pleased with how it's going. Fans are going, doors are open. I'm not sure what it'd be like in the winter. Maybe we won't be so keen to have windows and doors open then. But that's where I'm at. So I'm happy to, if people want to email me or talk to me in more detail about it, you're welcome.
And what I think was really important from Maureen's experience is that while I think Maureen raised the issues locally, and maybe wasn't necessarily at that time, Maureen, getting enough traction, but you don't have your managers, your principals, they're not ill-intended, they're not being nasty, they're just super busy, and I think perhaps at the time maybe didn't see it as a significant priority. So being able to utilise WorkSafe without going through a dispute resolution like without actually making it a disputation, I think was helpful and constructive without then, you know, affecting relationships
Well,
in
it
the
made
future.
it serious. It highlighted, well, we're looking at this seriously. I don't understand how pure the air is or what or whatever. I'm getting WorkSafe in to help us. It wasn't, you know, that was the language that was used, you know, so, and that was perfectly acceptable and seemed to be, oh yeah, oh well, that's good, you know, and then it sort of rolled on from there about analysing each room. Yeah, so it sort of made sense, but mind you, there weren't, I think they were a bit taken aback that WorkSafe were coming, but c'est la vie, I couldn't do it. That's the way it was. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah. And subsequent to that, the Department of Education has developed a significant amount of online resources for schools that's publicly available to health and safety reps, to school leaders to have a look at things like, you know, risk ratings for general rooms. So, for example, how does a staff room compare to a risk rating of a classroom which has cross ventilation windows, and, you know, to be able to sort of ascertain when a tranche of air purifiers comes, where best to place them and things like that. And then, as Maureen raised, now of course schools have these pieces of equipment that do require maintenance, and they do require cleaning, and there's a protocol that needs to be done around that. So there's written information for all of that, but it's voluminous and sort of, you know, down little internet rabbit holes, so it can be tricky for average pointers to find.
And could I add one more thing? I did forget one thing. The Education Department sent a rep also. So
yes, they did.
Yeah, the education rep did come, and she was very, very attentive and listened seriously. And they were rather generous with the amount of ventilators we've got. So, you know, she could see it was a cooperative thing. WorkSafe, me, the union rep or OHS rep. So it kind of made sense that we do it. Yeah. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks, Maureen. So I think we are ready to jump into the workshop. So this is, you know, a chance for you to talk about the specific situation at your workplace. I'm going to ask Davina to stop the record.